Hi all, hope you've been staying safe and well. Today is the last lesson that I'm going to be doing on English language paper 1. I'm going to have a look at the writing question. I'm going to have a look at the essentially section B of the paper. Now, important things to note before we start that this question on its own is worth half the marks on English language paper 1, and actually therefore is worth a quarter of your entire marks for your English language grade. So it's important to give this question the time and the effort and the attention to detail that it deserves. A lot of people don't give themselves enough time to answer this question adequately. Because they get too hung up on the reading questions. Now, some people have suggested doing this question first. I personally don't think that's a great idea because generally the extract in the reading section will give you some ideas and inspirations that you can use for the writing section. They're generally tied together with a theme. For example, if you're looking at the Jamaica in paper, the image might well be associated with weather, and you can use the ideas that have been discussed in the reading section. You have to be disciplined on the time with the reading questions to give yourself enough time to adequately write this response. In the same vein, though, we're not looking for huge amounts of writing. Doing 5, 6, 7 sides of paper probably isn't the best idea, because what we're looking for is well constructed and well crafted pieces of writing. It's definitely a case of quality rather than quantity with this question. So my plan today is we're going to have a look at the question itself, have a look at some strategies and ideas that you might want to consider. I'm going to show you our response that I wrote for a question, and then just talk about some ideas about how to plan it. It's quite difficult to teach the skills for writing. Essentially, a lot of this is to do with practice, having a look at different past papers, having a look at different images. That will give you a really, really good understanding of the type of questions that might come up and how you can flip things. If you see an image that you don't like or you find a bit difficult, don't forget that it's an inspiration. It's not necessarily exactly that image. So, for example, if you had an image of a character sitting in a bus, that bus could be anywhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be that particular incident or that particular event. It's inspired by or suggested by that particular image. So I'm going to present this now, and we'll have a look at what we have. Okay, so some of you will have seen this image before because I've used it in lessons previously, and I do think this is a really good example of the type of image that you could potentially get for this section B question on paper 1. It's obviously an image of a bombing raid during World War II, but then again, it's inspired by that image. It doesn't necessarily have to be that image, so you can think about taking it elsewhere. You will get a choice of 2 questions. Now, generally, there will be a picture and there will be a descriptive piece and there will be a narrative piece. That is not to say that there will always be that option. Sometimes it will be 2 descriptions, sometimes it will be 2 narratives. It might be worded slightly differently, but you will always get a choice of 2 things to do. You have here these 2 examples. Write a description suggested by this image and write a narrative which ends the horror of war, either of which you could use that image for, to be fair, which is what the piece I've chosen to do. Is it's a bit of a blend of both of these ideas. Now, it's worth 40 marks. The marking criteria are that you are given 24 marks for content and 16 for your spag. So this is the time when it is really, really crucial to pay attention to details. So things like ensuring that you're paragraphing, ensuring things like you are using a variety of different punctuation. So the expectation is that you will be able to craft sentences using commas, using semicolons, using colons, using exclamation marks when appropriate, not overly using them, using question marks, potentially using speech if it is appropriate, but trying not to include too much speech. Content-wise, it's looking for crafting. Does your description show someone who's taken time and care and attention to do this? Now, one way of approaching it, I like the image questions because I think with narratives you can tie yourself in knots trying to tell a story, particularly because you are limited in time. And the description of images gives you lots of scope for things to go for. Thinking about how you go about structuring a response, because obviously it's crucial to plan for this question. You don't just dive straight in and start writing. A strategy that I've used in the past is to section the image off into 6 or 7 different topics that you could potentially explore, and then detailed focus on those topics as your paragraphs. So, for example, one paragraph could be that I would have a look at the church in this image. Okay, so that would be paragraph 1. Paragraph 2 might be the plains. Okay, paragraph 3 might be the bridge. Paragraph 4 might be the searchlights. Paragraph 5 might be the river, and paragraph 6 might be the explosions. Now, what I would do is on my paper or in the answer booklet, it's actually probably better to do it in the answer booklet because then the examiner can see what you've done. Do a spider diagram with 6 branches going off for each of those ideas, and then try and include a range of techniques from the writer's toolkit that you're going to try and include in each paragraph. So say, for example, I'm really talking about the church. I would want to include a juxtaposition within that paragraph. So, for example, a good example of juxtaposition would be heaven and hell. And because I'm talking about a religious building, I can say something along the lines of a place that had seen so much joy and heavenly imagery now in the midst of hell would be a good example of juxtaposition. And I would add that to my plan. And what I'd be looking for is probably 3 or 4 different techniques I'm going to try and include in each paragraph to show that I've got that control, to show that I've got that structure, to show that I've got that ability to demonstrate effective writing skills. When we're thinking about SPAG, we'll be thinking about things like sentence construction. So could I include, for example, a short sentence, a simple sentence? Could I include compound and complex sentences? Could I do things like open with using a colon, using a definition, or doing an explanation in that sense? And when we read my example, you'll be able to spot some of these different ideas. So trying to include those different ideas, planning, obviously very, very crucial. What you'll end up then with is a spider diagram or a list, or however it is, with a plan, knowing this is what I'm going to talk about. And as you work your way through, try and essentially tick off those ideas as you are writing them. You're probably looking at 3 or 4 sentences per paragraph, and then you're probably looking at 4 or 5 paragraphs would be a decent level response. If you've got 2.5 sides of writing, that is an extended piece, which is going to demonstrate the skills that are necessary to get really good marks on this question. So this is my response here, and essentially what you will see is that each paragraph is a topic sentence, so that they have a focus within each one. I, rereading this, think that I'm a bit lazy in my openings, so that could be something that you potentially improve. But the first paragraph looks at the church itself, the second paragraph looks at the river, then the explosions, the plains, and then the bridge. Okay, so and then finally we have the smoke as the final one. Sorry, I didn't see that final paragraph. Have a listen, see what you think, and try and identify the techniques as I'm reading through. What sort of things am I doing to try and make this an effective piece of writing? The church tower stuck up like gravestones through the smoke, piercing the air and rising above the toxic smog. They looked like the broken fingers of a smashed hand, rising up from the soil and the blanket of death. The towers were blackened with soot and smoke, turning them from their once shining white to a deathly darkness. The ornate stonework was blasted by heat and rubble. Bricks began to tumble from the towers, raining down on the people below. The river was a flowing lava stream. The nightmare scene of the city was reflected twice in bubbling, swirling, thundering waters. The water was crimson, like the blood that was flowing through this city during this bombing raid. You could have said the colours were beautiful, like a phoenix, but the horror and screams that surrounded it made it seem like a river from hell. Debris and damage floated along like froth, twisting its way through the city like a tormented snake. The water seemed as if it was on fire, an inferno. The explosions all around were blasting and bursting, throwing rubble and broken buildings into the air. The craters the bombs made peppered the city so it looked like the moon. Huge holes appeared in the middle of once busy streets. Buildings that had stood for hundreds of years were flattened like pancakes. This wasn't just damage. The entire city was being wiped from the face of the earth. People's lives, their entire possessions, were thrown into the city streets, mingled with the sound of wailing. The screeching as the bombs rained down made them seem like demons screaming. The planes droned on overhead, unmoved by the horror they had created. They were like falcons scouring the city for their next victim and dropping death. The engines roared like a lion, demonstrating how powerful and dangerous they were. As the people looked up, the black silhouettes were eerie, and it seemed like these monsters were undefeatable. The low rumble of the engines seemed like an ominous warning, but you could never be sure where the next bomb was going to fall. How could anyone survive this? Miraculously, the bridge across the river was still standing, but for how long? If that was destroyed, then people would have nowhere to travel across the city. It stood defiant and proud against these demonic, savage plains. The bombs were raining down like hail, but still the bridge stood strong. The molten metal of its steelwork was slowly starting to bend. With an almighty creak, the bridge began to sway. It could not stand much more punishment. It was rocking like a drunken man, swaying from side to side, and as people gasped in horror, the monumental feats of engineering came crashing down. All that was left was a small island of rubble in the middle of a white-hot river, a gravestone to what that magnificent bridge had once been. The smoke lingered across the city like a blanket of death. It was so dark that the once gentle summer evening had become like the deepest, darkest winter. The poisonous cloud was thick with dust and toxic chemicals. The smell of sulphur and explosive powder stung the people's nostrils and made them retch. The city had become a tomb, encasing them all in its horror. The clouds of smoke drifted and filled every street like volcanic ash, creeping into people's lungs and coughing like old men. This was the true horror of war. Okay, so potentially this could be an example of a description, or it could be a narrative piece ending with the horror of war. Okay, so we won't look at everything, but if I was to look at a particular example, so for example, let's look at the plains paragraph. What we'll be looking at here is 3 or 4 sentences and trying to include a range of techniques within there. So if I'm going to highlight or look at particular techniques, I've got things like the planes droned on overhead. So the first thing I've tried to use is an example of the senses. So I've used the sound of hearing. So these the idea of the planes droning. Unmoving by the horror they had created. So the fact that the planes are creating the horror is personification, because it's the pilots and the people inside the planes that are actually creating the horror. But I'm giving the planes a personality. They were like falcons scouring the city for their next victim. So I've got a use of a simile. The fact that I'm comparing these planes to falcons scouring the city and dropping death. Now what we're seeing here is a good example of alliteration, because you've got the D sound. The engines roared like a lion, not my best simile, but demonstrating how powerful and dangerous they were. As the people looked up, the black silhouettes were eerie, and it seemed these monsters were undefeatable. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to include higher level vocabulary. I'm trying to include words, that wasn't great, that would be interesting for a reader, for an audience, something that's going to make the vocabulary stand out. If you look at the word like undefeatable, if you think about the syllables, undefeatable, it's a 5-syllable word, which means it's complicated language. It's using that more higher and sophisticated vocab. Silhouettes, a 3-syllable word. Ominous, 3 syllables. Anything like 3 syllables and above comes across as more complicated and complex language. Ending the paragraph, we have, you can never be sure where this bomb's going to fall. How could anyone survive this? So ending with a rhetorical question. Now, this comes from practice, and it comes from trying to be familiar with and being able to identify the techniques that you would like to use. If I was thinking back to my plan, I would have a point that I'm going to talk about the planes, and then I would say, okay, I'm going to try and include at least one simile, I'm going to try and include at least an example of alliteration, and I'm going to try and include at least an example of a rhetorical question within that paragraph. And essentially that would be it. The best way to plan for these types of questions is have a look at past papers and have a look at the different images and ideas that have been in there in the past, and essentially read good examples of descriptive writing, and your vocabulary will improve, and your ability to plan ideas and to think about interesting descriptions would improve as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop presenting this for a second and then return back to you. It's a difficult one to talk about because it's very much open to interpretation. It's very much open to your own revision and your own understanding of creative writing. I would recommend having a look at that writer's toolkit, have a look at some other examples of images and other examples of different creative writing. And like I say, read some good examples of creative openings to stories and creative ideas, because that will help you develop your own vocabulary. I hope that's been really useful. Obviously, I appreciate it's quite a difficult one to talk about. I hope that my piece of creative writing has given you some ideas potentially, or different ideas and ways of planning. If you find something that works for you planning wise, then please use that, because it's crucial to plan and set out your ideas before you start this. Probably the next set of videos that I'm going to have a look at, we'll be looking at paper 2, which will be after half term. But until then, obviously stay safe and take care.